they had this theory that people are more likely to make massive decisions in their life when their age ends in 9. Hirschfeld and Alter aren't saying there's any magic about being 29 or 39. What they're saying is that arbitrarily, our culture gives disproportionate importance to turning 30 or turning 40 or turning 50. And because of that arbitrary importance, as we approach those landmark decades, people start to contemplate how their life's going. And it's the act of stepping off autopilot, the act of contemplation, that gives us the chance to stop behaving habitually and start thinking about whether we're on the right course.
Welcome back to the You Can Too podcast. On today's show, we have an author, consultant, speaker. We have Richard Shotton on the show, and I'm so excited to dive into your book, to dive into all of the psychological biases that we have that we're completely unaware of, that just get in our own way, and I'm excited to dump in. So I want to start early on. The tipping point was a big moment for you that really encouraged you to jump into this space entirely. What was it about that book that really changed things for you?
So you're absolutely right. It was the Malcolm Gladwell's The Tipping Point that got me interested in behavioural science. And it was only a very, very small, almost tangential experiment that he talks about in that book.
Yeah.
So a lot of the book is around how our ideas spread. But one of the studies he talks about is the bystander effect. And now I read this study when I was working for I was an agency that was working for a government department. We were trying to encourage people to give blood. And in Britain, the blood service requires people to be generous, to donate their time and effort to give blood. And the bystander effect is an experiment that goes back all the way to the 1960s. And it's the idea that if you ask a large group of people to come to your aid, there's a diffusion of responsibility, and each individual is less likely to help you than if you asked a smaller group or people individually. And I can remember reading this précis from Gladwell of this experiment and thinking, this is exactly the problem that we're facing. We are going out in Britain and saying to people, please donate blood because blood stocks are low in England and Wales. We're asking everyone to donate, and unsurprisingly, most people are ignoring us. So when I read about the study, I thought we could take that core finding, the bystander effect. I went and spoke to the creative agency, very nice planner down there called Charlie Snow, and suggested, why don't we stop saying blood stocks are low in England and Wales, and why don't we try and create a bit more of a sense of personal responsibility? So we started saying blood stocks are low in London or blood stocks are low in Birmingham. Not a huge change, not a great creative leap, but trying to create a little bit more of a sense of personal responsibility. And the amazing thing, a week or two later, when we got the results back, there was a noticeable, I don't know exactly what it was, it was about 15 years ago, but 10 or 15% improvement in response rates. So what this did was prove to me that even if you went back to the 1960s and found some of these psychological studies, they had a really practical use in my field of marketing, but I think in the world of business. And back in that, 2004, 2005, I think I read that book, it wasn't being widely applied, certainly where I was working. So I thought there was this massive opportunity to take findings from academia into psychology, into behavioral science, and apply them for very real world commercial problems.
Yeah, absolutely. And it makes sense that your work resonates so much with people, because these concepts can be very, at least in the studies and everything that you've put into it, is very overcomplicated, but you make it practical and easy to understand, which is, I could assume, very difficult to even just narrow things down for people to understand. Like, I can imagine it's difficult. Yeah.
I've heard this brilliant description. It's a slightly derogatory description of academic psychologists, and they've been accused of having physics envy. So they've got a slight worry that theirs isn't a proper science, and therefore they try and wrap up what can be quite simple but powerful insights in overblown statistics, unnecessary, verbose jargon. And it's a real shame. I think if you look at academic papers from psychology and a lot of the social sciences, if you look at the papers from the 2020s, they are dripping in jargon. You go back to the 1950s and 1960s, and many of those academic papers were written like beautiful essays. And I think we've lost something in this unnecessary attempt to appear overly intellectual.
Yeah. Knowing that like it started so long ago, what do you feel has changed and what do you think has stayed the same in behavioral science?
So that's a great question. I tend to err towards the belief that most of these insights are remarkably evergreen,
Mm.
that when a robust finding is discovered, it doesn't ebb and flow out of fashion, probably because the operating system that humans use was developed hundreds of thousands of years ago, and in terms of evolutionary pace of change, 50 or 100 years ago is the blink of an eye. So I don't think the genuine insights into human nature are changing, but I think there has been some change in the field, the academic field. What the early experiments were guilty of often was using a student sample and assuming that they were representative.
Mm.
And I think that is a bit of a dubious assumption. So what more recent studies, at least the better ones do, is now try and run these experiments in the real world. Ideally, you don't want students who are paid £5 to take part in an experiment because one, there are, that's a very particular stage in life. Maybe that doesn't extrapolate elsewhere. And secondly, they know they're in experiments. There's a danger they start behaving in the way that they think is expected of them. But now you can turn to companies like Uber. They have a behavioral science team. Now you go in an Uber and odds are you're taking part in an experiment. That's a much, much more reliable source of insight because the people don't know they're taking part, so they're behaving naturally, and they can get a huge representative sample to get statistically significant findings. So generally, the insights or the human nature isn't changing, but we've got a better window onto human nature because the studies aren't afflicted by poor design or poor samples.
That's awesome. And a part of it comes down to not just doing one study, not just one experiment, because that's deeper as well. You have to be able to really do a lot more to see in different variables, the different environments, the different kind of people, and how that's going to affect over time. You've done a few as well. What have you learned from being a part of it?
Well, I think your point of even if an experiment has been done recently and it had a great design and a good sample, you're absolutely right. If it's a one-off experiment, treat it as an unproven hypothesis. Treat it, we would say in England, with a pinch of salt.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean it's useless, but I think your listeners need to think, well, how costly would it be in my personal life or my professional life to apply this unproven insight? If it's costless, like let's say I work in marketing, so I default to marketing, but it's about changing a color in a banner. You have to go out with a color anyway. Well, even an unproven hypothesis is quite useful. But if the requirement to test the hypothesis was involving a major change to your business or your life, well, I'd want to see more experiments before I went down that path, backing it up. So I think you're absolutely right. You want to see an insight applied in different situations repeatedly to have the greatest belief in it. So sorry, and then the second part was you mentioned around what was the question?
Yeah, what have you learned? Because you've done a few experiments, you've been in it in yourself. So what have you learned from it?
Yeah, I think when I wrote The Illusion of Choice, which was my second book, I think the two studies that I found most interesting, perhaps most surprising, were about the scale of value in communicating in a concrete way rather than an abstract one. So I reran a 1972 study by Ian Begg, which was done on a tiny sample size, and we gave people lists of phrases, and unbeknown to those people, there were two types of phrases. Sometimes they were abstract, like trusted provenance or high quality. Other times they were concrete, fast car, happy hen. And after about 5 minutes, we asked people to recall as much as they could. And we found that people were about 10 times more likely to remember the concrete phrase rather than the abstract phrase. So this supported Begg's original finding, but was on a more dramatic scale. And Begg's original finding was we are more likely to remember language that is concrete, that is, language we can picture, imagine. So you can imagine a fast car, or you can imagine a happy hen. We're more likely to remember that than language that is abstract, like high quality or trusted provenance. And I think when it comes to communicating, whether it's in your personal life, professional, or to colleagues, to potential consumers, that is a very, very simple thing to do once you realize it's so important. You know, the classic ad example is don't talk about megabytes of memory like all the competitors did. Talk about 1,000 songs in your pocket. And you can picture a pocket, you can imagine a song. That's tapping into that concreteness in a way that a megabyte doesn't. So if you're ever writing to a colleague or a friend or someone you want to influence, don't use abstractions. Try and use language that the other person can have a mental image of. And if you do that, I think you're tapping into one of the most powerful memory biases there is. And it was the scale of the impact that I think shocked me. That was one of the biggest eye-opening bits of research that I did for the illusion of choice.
Yeah, and it makes sense, right? Like when we can picture something, we're going to remember it more, we'll hold on to it more. I want to know, how does that reflect when it comes to confirmation bias? Because if we have confirmation bias towards whatever it may be, and we have concrete ideas that are just stuck in our head, how are we able to make that change, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I think I would have them as reasonably separate in that all concreteness does is improve the probability that something will be remembered.
Mm.
And that can be used for, good or ill. Confirmation bias would be that argument that we are not neutrally interpreting information that comes to us. We interpret through a lens of our existing beliefs. Now, these are all tendencies and propensities. So confirmation bias is a problem if you want to get people to change their minds. It doesn't mean you can never change their mind, but it makes it harder. Now, I think you've got a double whammy if you're trying to persuade someone to change their mind and you use abstract information and they already have a pre-existing opinion. You've got a slightly better chance if they have a pre-existing opinion and use concrete language, because at least you've got a chance to overcome that hurdle of confirmation bias. But what you might also want to do is think about specific research that suggests, well, what moments are people more open to changing their mind? So there are some lovely studies by Catherine Miltman, for example, at Wharton. She argues that people are loath to change their opinions because we put so much store on consistency within our culture. But she says when we enter a new time period, like the start of the year, after a birthday, after a public holiday, beginning of the week, beginning of the month, that link with the past self is weakened and therefore we become more open to change. So she then tested that principle by looking at a number of different data sets. She looked at Google search terms around things like quit smoking, start dieting. She looked at gym attendance and registration data. She looked at a website called Stick, where people make public pledges to change their behavior. And every one of those data sets showed the same broad pattern. There's an increasing probability of behavior change at the beginning of these new time periods. So I think confirmation bias, behavioral science doesn't just tell you the problem. It doesn't just explain the challenges you have. Other experiments also identify the most propitious moments for trying to change people's opinions.
Yeah, the fresh start effect is so cool. I find there's so many studies and so many examples that I'm excited to dive into, because just like that, it gives a concrete example. It's not just theory, but it's a concrete example of how it works. And it's so impactful. And to even think of that, whether it's through our habits or like beginning of a new year, you want to make a change. Everyone, that's kind of how
Yeah.
the lens that people see it through. It's really impactful. The fresh start effect. Is there anything else that from yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, just definitely. So the only thing I was thinking there was,
Yeah.
and this one sticks in my mind because I'd written The Illusion of Choice, and then I came across this example of the fresh start effect in practice and liked it so much, got the copy back and made a last minute amend.
Yeah.
And it's an example from the West Midlands Police. So this is a police force in Britain, second biggest area outside of London in the country, areas like Birmingham and Wolverhampton. And they sent out 2,000, I think it was, well, it might be, remember, either letters or emails, text messages to people that were known to the police, people who'd been convicted for a crime in the past, criminals. And they were trying to persuade all those criminals to change their behaviour and enrol in a government programme. Sometimes those bits of communication were sent out at a random time. Other times they were sent out just after the criminal's birthday. And they noticed a significant greater likelihood of someone calling the confidential hotline if they had received the communications after their birthday. From memory, it was of the order of about a 40 to 50% improvement in response rates. It was still low, like from 2% to 3%, but I think it was statistically significant at 90%. So, we can see the Fresh Start effect not just working on trivial decisions, even something like changing your life, trying to move away from a life of crime. We've got evidence that it can be effective.
It's so impactful when you really put it into perspective. And again, it makes sense that we think a new day, a new me, I can restart, and it's an easier way for our mind to think, let me restart now, rather than trying to go. It's like that all or nothing thinking that a lot of people have, right? You get to the middle of the day, things didn't go as exactly as planned. I'm just going to throw away today and I'm going to start tomorrow because it's easier for my brain to understand of some sort. When you spoke,
absolutely, yeah, it's a lovely way of applying it. I hadn't thought of the middle of the day part, but I think you're absolutely right.
yeah,
Yeah, it's an interesting one because this idea of the negativity we have as cultures, especially British and American culture. Politicians are flip-floppers if they change their mind. There's lots of negative terminology for people who are inconsistent. So letting people have a sliver of opportunity to kind of slough off their past selves and not feel like a hypocrite's change is something that we should either catalyse when we're trying to change our own behaviour or the behaviour of others. There is an interesting flip, though, because in the same way, if you want to get people to change, these are moments you should identify and target. But you can also apply this principle of commitments and consistency to your own advantage. There's a psychologist at Columbia University called Steve Martin. He came over to Britain and ran a series of studies with our health service. So the NHS in Britain is medicine that's free at the point of delivery. So there's no insurance, no payment. You have free healthcare. It comes out of general taxation. Great in many ways, but the downside is if you're given something for free, some people don't treat it with the respect it deserves, and lots of people don't turn up for their appointments. What Martin did was test ways of boosting the proportion of people who came to repeat appointments. So he finds a chain of healthcare practices in kind of central England. And what they were previously doing was when someone came out of their original appointment, they would talk to the receptionist. The receptionist would write down on a piece of card, this was 2012, time and date of the next appointment. So Martin measures what proportion of people are not showing up in that situation. He then creates two interventions. The first intervention, when the patient comes out of their first appointment, the receptionist gives them the card with the date and time. The receptionist now asks the patient to repeat back when and where they're going to turn up. And that led to, I think, a 3 or 3.5% reduction in no-shows. And then the final, most successful intervention, patient comes out of their first appointment, goes and sees the receptionist. Receptionist gives them a piece of card that's blank, and it's the patient that writes down the time and date that they're going to go for their next appointment. And in that setting, there is an 18% reduction in no-shows. Now, Martin's argument, consistent with Miltman's, is people feel a strong pressure to be consistent with their past statements or past behaviours. But his argument is that bias is only tapped into if it is an active commitment. If you just have passively accepted a time and date, you don't feel such a strong obligation. But if you've said you're going to do something, or you've written down what you're going to do, it's much harder for someone to backtrack. Now, that's super useful if you're a healthcare system. It's super useful if you're a restaurant. When you tell your customers the time and date of their appointment, actively ask them, will you let us know if you can't make that? And don't just allow them to passively assent, wait till they respond. But likewise, you can apply it to your own behavior. We talked about New Year's resolutions. If you want to start more exercising more, quit smoking or stop drinking, don't just internally tell yourself you're going to do that. Find someone that you can tell, or write it down. Write down what you're going to change, and it's more likely that you'll have success if you do so.
Yeah, the concreteness, making it tangible in the world to see it is really big, and it reminds me of another study that I want to say it was Milkman as well, with the lottery tickets, where people want to have some kind of agency, they want to have some kind of control, in some way. Is that kind of another
Yes, I think
example of
that
that?
was. I think that was. If it's the same one we're thinking of, I think that was an Ellen Langer study, and
Ellen
you're
Langer, yep,
right. It's an
yep.
absolutely brilliant study. So she was, I think, at Harvard. I think she might still be active, but she did that study back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Brilliant study. Goes round an office block, not a huge sample to be fair, but goes round an office block, sells lottery tickets for $1. And the twist in the experiment is some people pick their numbers, some people are given their numbers. She then waits a week, goes back to the office block, tries to buy those tickets back. And her key finding is if people were given their numbers, they want $1.96, I think, on average. Whereas if people picked their numbers, they want $8.67, or around that number. So you have a more than a fourfold increase in valuation of what is a commodity. And the argument here is exactly as you say, people want this sense of control. It's a fundamental thing to want a degree of agency. So if people feel that they have been involved, that they've actively picked something, they value it much higher. So again, yeah, I think that might be a really useful one if you're trying to encourage maybe your partner or your children to do something differently. My kids are a bit old now, but it used to be you don't tell them to eat the broccoli. You say, do you want broccoli or carrots? A basic, almost meaningless choice from the perspective of getting more vegetables on board. You give people that small degree of control, and they're more likely to be engaged and follow through.
Yeah, and I think even though it was a small study, it for most people, I think they could abide by that being true. For most people, we want to have some kind of control in some sense, or we want to at least have the ability to make a decision, even if it has no impact, which is, it makes sense in our brain. But I want to touch on the need to be consistent, because for so many people, we're consistent in things that aren't in our best interest, for example. And so
Yep.
why is it? Is it just because it gives us a false sense of certainty that we know what's going to happen in the future? Or like, where does that need to be consistent come from?
Yeah, that's a good share. I think often when we start discussing why these findings occur, it becomes a bit more subjective, because the experiment tells you it happens. It's then a story about explaining what happens. But two reasons that resonate with me is maybe the fear of social opprobrium. There's an awful lot of experimentation about how deeply we're influenced by other people. So I wonder if it's a fear of getting a bad reputation with other people. The second part could be a bit more prosaic, and it's simply life is complex. And if we weighed up every decision, we would struggle to get through life. We wouldn't get out of the door in the morning if we thought about, well, what type of clothes am I going to wear? How am I going to clean myself? What am I going to have for breakfast? What mode of transport am I going to use to get into work? If we sat down and every single day thought through those questions, it would be a complete waste of time. So people recognise that rather than thinking things through deeply on every occasion, often it's simpler to just repeat the same behaviour that worked the last time in a similar situation. So I think you could bundle that under the terminology of habits. Once you've got a habit embedded, you keep on doing the same thing unthinkingly without reflecting on the alternatives until you meet a disruptive force. So if you're behaving in a positive way, habits are absolutely brilliant. But you're right. If you have a destructive behaviour, you need to be looking at ways of disrupting those habits, like the fresh start effect, or or many other moments that psychologists have identified.
Yeah, you talk about making it easy as well. For a lot of people, they're trying to increase the motivation, whether that's in marketing or within themselves. They're trying to find the motivation instead of making it easier on themselves and reducing the friction. Why is that so impactful? Because I feel that
Yeah, I think
that's so big.
that's a brilliant place to talk about, and it's a really tricky one, because I think the danger is when people hear about this behavioral science principle, the immediate reaction is, "Oh, that's obvious," and then
Mhm.
they ignore it, which is problematic because many very respected behavioral scientists, people like Richard Thaler, Daniel Kahneman, they often argue if there's one principle from behavioral science that you should harness, it's this idea of make it easy. And the broad principle would be two ways to change behavior. You can either boost people's motivation to change, or you can make that desired behavior as easy as possible. There is a tendency amongst us to think that appeal and motivation is the more important part, but experiments suggest it's actually removing tiny bits of friction that tend to be more effective. Now, the problem with this is if you tell people, make your behavior easier and people will do more of it, they sometimes stare at you and think you're an idiot because it's an obvious thing to say. But the point of these studies is the removal of friction repeatedly and consistently has a bigger effect than people expect. It's sometimes ridiculously small barriers that put people off changing their behavior. So one of the studies I really like is a University of Pennsylvania one from Rosin. I can't remember the exact year, but it's probably about 10 years ago now. And he works for the cafeteria at the university for a number of weeks. And they alternate the serving style for the vegetables. Sometimes it's easy to help yourself to lots of vegetables. There's a big serving spoon. Other times there are tongs. And Rosin finds that on the weeks that the serving spoons are used, there's an 8 to 16%, depending on the vegetable, increase in volume of consumption. Now, that is a tiny, tiny change, yet it has a sizable effect, especially when you multiply it across all the people going to the cafeteria. Most people would think that the way to change vegetable consumption is to, add loads of salt and sugar, make them taste nicer, mix up some bacon into them, or whatever. But what Rosen shows is that actually, removing the almost invisible bits of friction that are there can have a really, really big effect. So I think ease is a very powerful bias that we just keep on underestimating. People get so excited about some of the counterintuitive, weird and wacky behavioral science ideas, they ignore the more obvious ones that have the biggest effect.
Do you think that that comes down to our confirmation bias when it comes to things have to be difficult? I think people a lot of people it needs to be complex. It's like this like everything that we're speaking about right now, everyone believes it's too complex, but when we speak about it and we narrow it down, then it's a different kind of confirmation bias towards the fact that it can be possible. I feel
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've heard, and you've got to be careful because sometimes people talk about a bias when it's more of a theory than an
right.
evidence-based one. But I have heard people talk about proportionality bias. I've never seen many studies that back it up,
Mm,
but it fits with my experience search, and certainly that if people have a big problem, they often look for really big interventions to solve it.
mhm.
They will dismiss the smaller things because they feel too trivial. And I think you might be right. For such a big problem, people can't believe that something as trivial as switching a tong to a serving spoon could have a meaningful impact. I wonder if there's also an element of we don't like to think of ourselves as snap decision makers. I think
Mhm.
it makes us feel a bit uncomfortable.
Right.
We want to think that all our decisions are thought through and rational and deeply considered.
Mhm.
And if we're just making a single decision and we have 15 minutes to mull it over, well, that would be a very sensible thing to do. But people are making hundreds of decisions in quick succession. It'd be illogical to behave in that way. But when we reflect on our own nature, I don't think we like to admit the importance of these reflexive, snap, speedy decisions.
Yeah, no, I'm right with you on that, and that does make sense. All of this ends up making sense when you put it into perspective, but for so many, we're just going through not even aware that these biases are even, acting out in our lives. And you speak about making it difficult as well. I'd love for you to talk about that.
Yeah, so there's an argument here of firstly, the general principle is you remove friction and it has an outsized effect. Now, of course, you can flip that on its head and say, well, if there's a behaviour you don't want to happen, well, make sure you're adding friction in. One example of that from Britain, but it's been repeated across Europe, is around suicide. So it used to be 80s, maybe late 80s, one of the most common ways of committing suicide in Britain was an overdose of paracetamol. Back when that was a real big killer of people, you used to be able to go to supermarkets, mini marts, and buy big tubs of paracetamol. All you have to do is flick off the top and pour them down, and you made an attempt to kill yourself. The law change, and I'm struggling to remember if it was late 80s or early 90s, came into being, and it said that non-pharmacies could only sell, I think, a maximum of 16 paracetamol, and they had to be in a blister pack. So now you would, if you wanted to kill yourself through that means, you would have to go from shop to shop to shop, buying lots of packets, and then you'd have to sit there at your kitchen table popping out all those pills. On one hand, we think, well, that will make no difference. It's such a big decision in people's lives. Surely that little bit of effort won't put people off. But of course, actually, it does, because whilst people might be depressed for a long time, while they might be feeling suicidal for a long time, the decision to actively go out and execute that plan is often remarkably short in time. And we know that because people who survive, when they're questioned, a sizable proportion say it was a fleeting feeling. It was a few minutes before that they'd had that idea to execute the plan. So what Keith Horton did at Oxford University was look at suicide through paracetamol dose in Britain before and after the regulation, and he saw a massive change in a reduction post introduction of that little bit of friction. So even in the most serious decision that anyone could make, you can still see the value there of adding friction into the process.
Yeah, and whether it's a massive decision or a small decision, it has a big impact. And I think of this when I first started getting into business and started my podcast. I used to have a PS4 and a TV in my room. And I took the PS4, put it under my bed, and I took the TV off the wall. And that little bit of friction of taking things out and having to put it back up and set everything up just to go on and play or do whatever, haven't done it in 3 years. And so it makes it a lot more difficult. And small decisions, it's just like making it easy when you want to go to the gym in the morning, put your clothes out before you go to bed. And that's a lot easier, one less step to think about to make another decision to make it easier on yourself. Both ways have a big impact. This podcast is kindly brought to you by Magic Mind. Now, if you're anything like me, you love coffee, but you hate the jitters that it gives you in that 2 p.m. slump in the afternoon when you still have a lot of day left, but you're not able to be focused throughout that time. And this is why I love Magic Mind. I've been taking it with my morning coffee. It's a small productivity shot that I absolutely love. It's with matcha, which takes longer to release in your body. So instead of feeling slumped at 2 p.m., you actually have that intentional focus and it reduces stress. So I take it with my morning coffee. It helps me drink less coffee, but actually feel focused and not wired throughout the day, which is so impactful because if you're a podcaster or you're taking calls or you're just in general, you need to be focused and have that mental energy. It's been something that's really helpful for me. I've been using it for a few weeks and I guarantee that you will like it. So if you're anything like me and you want to feel focused but not wired, you can go to magicmind.com/youcan2 for 56% off. Yes, 56% off your first subscription. And for your first one-time payment, you can get 20% off, which is insane to say the least because they have a 100% money back guarantee with no questions asked. And instead of waiting 3 to 5 days for that money back, they'll refund you in 3 to 4 hours because they believe in it. And I believe in it so much. So that's magicmind.com/youcan2 for up to 56% off your first subscription. And if you already use Magic Mind, you can get a discount off your next subscription payment as well. So it's magicmind.com/youcan2. Try it for a few weeks, see if you like it. I bet you that you will, and you will feel a lot more intentional with your day instead of just so wired and really just exhausted by the end of the day. Back to the episode.
I think those are lovely examples. For me, I've got a weakness for crisps, or as you call them, chips. Mm-hmm. So I don't have them in the house.
Yep.
The shop that I can buy them from is 2 minutes walk.
Mhm.
So if I really, really want them, I can still go and get them. But on many occasions, I can't be bothered, and therefore my crisp consumption has dropped. Now, I've heard people criticise this recently. They say, okay, well, wait a minute. If you have the willpower not to buy the crisps, well, you're also going to be the type of person who could ignore them when you're in a house. Or vice versa. They say, well, if you haven't got the willpower to ignore the crisps in your house, why would you have the willpower not to put them in your weekly shop?
Mhm.
But to me, that criticism isn't a fair reflection on human nature.
No.
We are varied in terms of our behaviour over time. And one of the variances is over whether we are picking for ourselves now or whether we're picking for our future selves.
Mhm.
So there's a brilliant study by Daniel Reed at Warwick University.
Mhm.
So he does this with Danish employees at a company. It's about 200 people. Half of them, he says, do you want to eat this apple now or this chocolate bar? Pick which one you want. You can just have one. And 75% of people pick the chocolate bar. Gets the other half of the people, same chocolate bar or apple, but he says, pick which one you want, and in a week's time, I'll come and give it to you. Now you get an almost exact flip. So it's 75% of people picking the apple, 30% picking the chocolate. When we pick for our future self, we are very influenced by our thoughts and how we should behave. When we pick for our current self, we pick how we want to behave. So that's when our base instincts about, gorging on fast food are so powerful. So I think you can hack this discrepancy to your own advantage. Put in place things that you agree with when you are thinking about your future self, like putting your gym kit out the morning before, because everyone agrees the idea of a 9 o'clock run at 9 p.m. But when it comes down to 9 a.m., if you haven't done anything to activate that desire, it's far easier to keep on lying in bed.
Yeah, it's the thinking about how you want to feel after the thing rather than thinking about how you feel before the thing.
Well,
Hal Hirsch.
that's a nice way. I think you know trying to at least make the first step on the journey
Yep.
while you're contemplating your future self. So for me, that's when I'm ordering from my online supermarket, not putting the chips in. That's something that's not going to affect me here and now. It'll affect my future self. Very easy for me to make the right dietary decision. For you, I really like that point about where you leave your gym kit out for tomorrow. It's much easier to make those first steps when they involve your future self rather than your current self.
Yeah, I think part of it is Hal Hirschfield talks a lot about the future self and thinking about your future self. And I know that some of your work involves him as well. But I think a lot of this comes down to the most disciplined people are in environments that make it easy to be disciplined. Right. And I think when you don't have anything around like food or whatever it may be that you don't want to indulge in, when it's not there, it's not hard to be disciplined because it's not there. And that's the same thing for making it easy and making it hard.
I think you're absolutely right there that if you are in an environment where you constantly have to deny yourself, if you sit next to a bowl of, an open bowl of tortilla
Mhm.
chips, sooner or later your willpower is going to be eroded away. It's only a matter of time. If you don't want to eat those, it's much better not to have them in your eye line. There, I think if we have this operating model where we think the way to behave properly is to boost our willpower,
Mhm.
we will put ourselves in situations where we're doomed to fail. If we think the operating model is to avoid ever being in a tempted situation, that is far more in tune with reality and it will set us up for success.
Absolutely. And to talk about willpower, is there anything that you've learned when it comes to willpower? Because I've heard two different sides of the story of, you go throughout your day and your willpower decreases as you go on. And part of that is a belief system that you believe that your willpower decreases, or the fact that it actually is true that the willpower does decrease. What have you known about
So
that?
this isn't an area that I know a huge amount about, but it's an interesting one because the idea of like decision fatigue
Yep.
Became very popular about, let's say 10 years ago.
Mm.
And unfortunately, the original paper that caught everyone's attention was by Danziger, I think, where he looked at Israeli judges and whether or not they gave people parole or not when they came up in front of them. And Danziger found that he argued the easy decision is not to give them parole. And as the day went by, you saw these massive reductions in the number of people given parole. People then have lunch, judges have lunch. When they come back, parole rates shoot up again, and then they just drop down through the day. Mm-hmm. And that caused a real storm. It got lots of popular acclamation, lots of coverage. But then a follow-up study became suspicious because the scale of the effect was off the charts. And they said, look, if decision fatigue was this big, surely the whole of our society would be structured around it. We wouldn't let people drive in the mid-afternoon because they'd be crashing everywhere.
Right.
So they looked at that Israeli data and they found an anomaly, which was the cases that came up in front of judges weren't randomly allocated. Often the harder ones were skewed towards the end of the session. Yeah. So they argued it wasn't decision fatigue, it was a quirk of the Israeli judicial system. So decision fatigue suddenly became stained with this faulty paper. But the problem with that is it's not decision fatigue that has been disproved. What you've shown is that the study wasn't very well designed. There was this confounding factor that invalidates the results. But people didn't take that nuanced view. They thought, oh, well, this whole decision fatigue idea is ridiculous. But other studies done in separate situations have found, maybe not the same scale as Danziger, but something pretty similar. There's a study by Linda, who I think is at Harvard, amongst doctors, which shows the unnecessary prescription of antibiotics goes up during the day, drops after lunch, and starts going back up again. Now, that is a robust finding. So it does seem that making decisions is hard work, and over time people use up some of their supplies, as it were, of willpower or effort, and they become more likely to take the easy decision. And the easy decision for a doctor is give the patient antibiotics, get them out of the consultation, make sure they leave happy. So there is supporting evidence for that point, just not maybe as dramatic as the original Danziger stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you touched on that, because I was going to ask about that. That was a great study about that. I've heard you speak about it a few times, and it makes sense. I know the Pratt-Fall effect is one of your favorite biases, and I'd love to know why does that one stand out to you amongst all of the ones that you've spoken about and researched?
Yeah, I think that one, it stands out because if you look at the greatest adverts, you often see it being used. Yet if you look at the entirety of adverts, it's remarkably rare. So the Pratt-Fall effect is this idea that if you admit a flaw, you become more appealing. And you can go through almost a who's who of the best ads ever and see it. Listerine, taste hate twice a day. Guinness, good things come to those who wait. VW, ugly is only skin deep. They've talked about their bad taste, their slowness, and their ugliness. They've drawn attention, those three campaigns, to three pretty big flaws. But just as Elliot Aronson argued, if you tell people about a flaw, proactively, not let them discover it, but you proactively tell them, you're distinctive, you stand out from most people. Most people brag. So if you admit a flaw, you're going to be noticed. You boost your believability. There's studies particularly into this element. In this case, it's often called the stolen thunder technique. If you admit a problem with your argument, even if you don't try and counterbalance it in any way, you have a stronger case, a more persuasive case than if someone else draws attention to that problem. Because what you've done essentially is if you admit something that's not in your interests, you've tangibly proved your honesty, and then everything else you say becomes that bit more believable. And then the third and final strength of the Pratt-Fall effect is, certainly in British culture and American culture, strengths and weaknesses are often two sides of the same coin. So for Listerine, you say you taste awful. People make an assumption that, well, if it tastes that bad, it must be really potent. Right. Now, if you are clever about the flaw that you admit, you can tap into an associated set of strengths. So if you're a small business person or you're a consultant, sometimes it might be quite good to emphasize that you're costly because people will assume that you must be high quality.
Yeah, I absolutely love that effect. And when I heard you speak about it, it again makes so much sense when you put it into perspective. But a lot of people want to be seen as everything's perfect. And so they don't talk about the flaws. They don't talk about those things, but even not overly emphasizing it, but talking about it in a sense that it doesn't even relate to the actual strength that you have gives you some kind of relatability as you're speaking about. Is there any other studies that you can think of or any other biases that just stand out to you that have just stand the test of time?
I think the other one that if you look at well, there's two really. If you look at studies that try and compare the effect of different biases, the two that always score towards the top are social proof. This is the idea that if I can show that a product or a way of behaviour is popular, it will become more popular still. That has been researched back to the 1930s, dozens upon dozens of experiments that show that works. I think that is a consistent and powerful bias. And then the other one that's very related is scarcity, that people want what they can't have. People want things that are in short supply. Lots of studies show that if you show two groups of people exactly the same products, but for one group you emphasize there isn't much of it available, others that it's in abundant supply, it's the first group that will be prepared to pay more, that will find that product more appealing, that will enjoy using it more. So I think there is a danger sometimes with behavioural science that we become obsessed by the latest new finding or the thing that's very quirky. But those two biases have stood the test of time, and they tend to have a very powerful effect.
They definitely have a powerful effect, and I feel like it almost comes down to the perceived value is more important than the actual value. And those are almost two examples of that, where the value of whatever it may be may not all the ways be there, but if you have the social proof and if you have the ability to point towards people with not many, just the scarcity aspect of it, you're going to want to learn more about it. It's our curiosity, the nature in itself. You,
Yeah, and it's a recognition that for many people, there's going to be a skepticism about what a business or a brand says. If Ford or Nike say their product's amazing, virtually everyone is going to react by thinking, well, you would say that, wouldn't you? We know that your profits depend on you telling us your product is amazing. So why would I believe that? But if we are aware that lots of people like ourselves are picking Nike or picking Ford or picking whatever brand, we assume all those members of the public are behaving in a way that will maximize their enjoyment of life, that those other people have weighed up the cost and benefit. So we give greater weight to what the crowd does, especially our kind of personal crowd, our a group of like-minded people. We give greater weight to what they're doing rather than what a brand is saying. It might not be a perfect guide to the correct decision, but it's a hell of a lot better listening than adverts.
Yeah, you've spoken about stated versus revealed preferences as well, right? And I want to dive deeper into that because I feel like what behavioral science is in its entirety is how people behave versus how they claim to behave, or like how they actually do versus claim to. So, why is it that we have this habit of saying one thing or doing one thing and then completely meaning and wanting to do something else?
I think there's two elements. There's part of it that sometimes if we're put on the spot, we almost we bend the truth because we want people to think that we are probably better than we are. So we answer surveys, we answer focus groups as how we should behave rather than how we actually behave. So there is an element, I think, of sometimes purposely misleading the researcher. But the bigger problem is summed up by a brilliant psychologist called Timothy Wilson, who's at the University of Virginia. He describes people as being strangers to themselves. And what he means by that is people don't have full introspective insight into their motivations. So if you put them on the spot, they'll give you lots of plausible reasons for buying a lager or picking a particular trainer brand. The problem is many of them will be misleading. They don't know their own motivations, so they're just grabbing things that sound reasonable to themselves. That's an issue, because if a brand or a business accepts those claims at face value, it will push them off in the wrong direction when they're making decisions. Much better to run simple test and control experiments. If you have a website, you have a laboratory. 100 people come to your site, randomize them into 1 or 2 or 3 different cells or groups, and keep everything the same about their experience apart from one thing. And then any difference in behavior, you can attribute back to that single changed variable. That's the real test of an idea, rather than what people tell you to your face.
Yeah. All this stuff is so impactful, and having the studies to back it is even more important, because like we've spoken about many times, the just having one idea is not good enough, and the concreteness of it all is so important, because it's practical in life. And I'm curious, is there anything that stood out to you over the time? Because you've been in this almost 2 decades now. Like, what has kept you continuously interested in it? Because obviously there's so many studies and things continuing to come out.
I think there's a mix that keeps me interested. On one hand, I love the fact that something you learn in 2004 will still be relevant in 2023.
Right.
And therefore it feels like, if you immerse yourself in the topic, you can have this continuing building level of knowledge. And I love that.
Yeah.
And when I previously worked in marketing and I didn't know about psychology and behavioral science, I felt just on this hamster wheel of learning things that faded in and out of fashion, that weren't leading to a progressive base of knowledge. So I love this sense of progression from a personal level.
Mm-hmm.
But the second thing, which might sound a bit contradictory at first, is there's never an endpoint. I mean, the subjects that we're talking about in behavioral science and psychology is the human mind. It's such a complex thing. There are always new bits of research coming out. There are always intricacies. And I think it's such a complex thing. We're going to be learning about it for generations to come. So I think that mix of the eternal nature of existing findings, but the constant creation of pushing the boundaries forward on the subject. It's those two things working in combination that's so enjoyable.
Yeah, it's like there's a stagnant and then there's the ever changing, that there's always things
Yeah.
coming out. And I can imagine that being in it for such a long time, that there's a lot of things that were true at one point that were disproven later on, or that were realized to be a smaller subset of people instead of a broader kind of example that doesn't have that kind of big of a pull on society or the decisions that we make.
Yeah, the interesting there's so for example, one of the studies that got debunked that I talked about in the Choice Factory was this idea called nominative determinism.
Yes.
So fascinating experiment. A psychologist, I forget the name, had the idea of ranking from public data source the popularity of male names. And he saw that Dennis and Walter were very close. So let's say Dennis is 256, Walter was 257th in popularity. And the idea of nominative determinism is that we are more likely to take jobs that reflect our name. So Dennis's are more likely to become dentists than Walters because of the similarity of sound for a Dennis, which is absent for a Walter.
Yeah.
So the psychologist looked at this giant list of names, then went and found a public database for the names of dentists, and found, exactly as the theory suggests, more dentists were called Dennis than Walter. And at first, it feels like a robust finding.
Makes sense, right?
But someone came along and spotted a flaw in this methodology. And he said, well, yes, there are more dentists called dentists, but there are also more farmers, there are more doctors, there are more coffee salesmen. The fact is that Dennis is a younger name, so there are more people of working age, whereas Walters tend to be much more likely to be retired. So it wasn't that the data was manipulated. It wasn't that it was any malpractice. There was just a mistake in the data collection, which led to an erroneous finding. So there are certainly studies like that got a lot of prominence and then are later debunked. The the upside is this is not happening to giant principles like social proof or
Right.
scarcity or loss aversion that have been around for 50 years. It's often the smaller, quirkier insights that flare up and then flare down. So that's the positive, I think, from behavioural scientists' angle. The negative is I think we're still missing an opportunity. What should happen is a study is debunked and then it almost gets purged from the literature and people stop repeating it.
Yeah.
But the problem is that a study like Nominative Determinism, it's just such a wonderful story. You want to go and tell your friends this amazing, quirky facts when you see them at a cafe or a pub. And because it's media friendly, because it's amusing, people repeat the original finding about dentists and dentists.
Mhm.
What they don't do is repeat or publish the far more mundane rebuttal of the
Mhm.
finding. I've heard people call these like zombie findings. They've been killed, but they keep on living. They're the living dead in terms of psychology experiments. So I think we've got to, as a media, as an industry, be much better at focusing the dissemination of the proven robust studies, not the ephemera that catches people's eyes.
Yeah, I can imagine with so many coming out and even just the past that are still there, it can be easy to just get lost in translation with so many things. And with new things coming out as well, it makes it even more difficult to think about how let's just get rid of the things that are disproven because
Yeah,
we're only thinking about
absolutely.
what's
There's a
next.
structural problem here, which is academics want to appear in journals. That's how they show their value. That's how they get
Mhm.
promoted. And journals want to produce new findings. So there's this pressure on people to come up with novel approaches.
Mhm.
There's not much incentive to retest other people's ideas. Now, that retesting of old ideas or previous findings would have massive value, but no one's going to build their career by proving another person's an idea. So we've got the incentives wrong in academia, and I think that isn't something that just afflicts psychology; it afflicts all sciences. And that I think is something that we really do as a society need to tackle.
No, I'm right with you on that. I am right with you on that. I want to know because like I said earlier, your one of your favorite biases is the Pratt-Fall effect, and I'd love to
Yeah.
know what is a surprising piece of knowledge that you can think of that maybe not many people are really aware of to begin with.
Um, I think you mentioned one earlier about, I think you said Hal Hershfield, didn't you? That he came up with a brilliant and very surprising study called Nine Enders. So
Mhm.
he worked with Adam Alter.
Yep.
Adam Alter's at NYU. I can't remember where Hal Hershfield is. It might be UCLA.
You see, yep. You see,
Okay. They had this theory that people are more likely to make massive decisions in their life when their age ends in 9. And when I first read about that, I read about it in a tabloid newspaper. So I thought, this is just rubbish. This is one of these studies that people haven't bothered to check. It's not going to be
right.
properly academic. But that was my prejudice that was proved completely wrong. So I went and tried to find the original study, and when you read about it, as you say, it starts to become a lot more intuitive.
Mhm.
Hirschfeld and Alter aren't saying there's any magic about being 29 or 39. What they're saying is that arbitrarily, our culture gives disproportionate importance to turning 30 or turning 40 or turning
Right.
50. And because of that arbitrary importance, as we approach those landmark decades, people start to contemplate how their life's going. And it's the act of stepping off autopilot, the act of contemplation,
Mhm.
that gives us the chance to stop behaving habitually and start thinking about whether we're on the right course. And they went and tested that idea in lots of different data sets, from marathon runners for the first time, affairs, suicides. And for each of their data sets, they saw a pronounced spike when people's age ended in 9. So that to me is one of the findings that was so surprising when I first heard of it from slightly unreputable source in terms of the magazine that repeated it.
Right.
I didn't believe it at all. It was only when going and reading that Hirschfeld and Alter's brilliant paper that both saw the explanation and the brilliant way of testing it.
Yeah, it's almost the fresh start effect where you're thinking about, okay, this next decade is coming up. This is serious. Let me really think about how I want to approach this next decade. And then as soon as you
Yeah.
get
Yes.
there, it doesn't really have much of an impact.
Yeah. So it's interesting because you're right. It is related to the fresh start effect. But rather than it being that clean sheet afterwards,
Right.
it's the approach that
Hmm.
breaks the autopilot and gets reflection that's so powerful. So, you know, different opportunities there. I think if you're a government advertiser
Hmm.
and you want people to quit smoking or to stop binge drinking,
Hmm.
29-year-old, 39-year-olds are a brilliant audience to consider because they're already open,
Hmm.
more open to persuasion they would have been a year or two either side. So for some, health related campaigns, certainly for government or agencies, it's a really powerful insight that I think is not well used enough as it should be.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that that is something. It is very surprising. It makes sense again when you put it into perspective. When you have
Mm,
the fresh start effect, when you have that in your mind, the confirmation bias is like, oh, of course that the next season of life or the next decade is going to be something where a lot of change happens. But the anticipation of that is what makes people get out of autopilot, which is so cool. It's really
yeah,
inspiring to hear.
yeah.
There's one last question I ask every
Oh
guest,
yeah.
and absolutely it's what I want to do with this podcast. And my question to you is more directed towards you. You've been in the space for, like I said, 2 decades, and you've learned so much. You've written so much. You've impacted so many people. My question to you is, what belief are you currently unlearning?
Oh, well, I would say I think it's my habit of the end of the day eating salty snacks and opening a beer. And what I would also, maybe a good place to end is saying you can know all these theories and it increases the propensity to change. It gives
Right.
you, it skews the odds in your favor. It doesn't make it easy. I'm still battling one too many beers a week and probably one or two bags of crisps too many a week. So I think that it's a healthy reminder that yes, behavioral science is a brilliant set of insights that can help us change our own behavior and change the behavior of others. But change is still hard. All we're doing is making it slightly easier.
Yeah, it's the awareness isn't enough to make the change, but it does make it easier to make the change. It makes you more conscious of the change that is possible, rather than seeing as most people go through life as
Yeah,
a constant, which is really
yeah.
important.
I mean, if you try and change the behavior of 100 people and you don't use any behavioral science techniques, maybe you persuade 10.
Right.
Well, if you start bringing in social proof and public commitments and the fresh start
Mhm.
effect, you might edge it up to 15 or 20. Now, that is a brilliant change. You could double maybe the proportion of people that you've influenced. Look at it from another perspective, there's still 80 people out of 100 out there that are completely ignoring what you're saying. So you've got
Yeah.
this paradoxical finding that behavioral science is both a powerful force, but also um, people still find it very easy to ignore even the most behaviorally informed of messages.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
Oh,
I
you're
love this
welcome. It's brilliant
conversation.
to chat. Yeah.
Whenever you come out with the next book, if that's in the future, I want to have you
Fine.
on again. All of that you do, I can ask a trillion questions, and I feel like we're gonna have a great conversation. Is there anywhere you'd like to direct people? Of course, all your links will be in the show notes.
Oh, no, no, much appreciated. So, yeah, if people are interested, the two books I've written are The Choice Factory and The Illusion of Choice. And then the other thing I've just done recently is create a self-paced training course. So if people want to apply behavioral science to marketing or business, it's at ferment.io. So it's a self-paced video-based course.
Awesome. Thank you
Thanks a
so
lot.
much.